and of course, where they land in terms of land use and land use planning. When we look at some of the key responses that we've seen, some of the most interesting do come from very, very innovative communities. Canmore developed a very interesting and innovative approach to engage with community, local artists, and the broader business community as a response to COVID that has seen a remarkable response and really positive effects that have now trickled over into the later years or months of the COVID pandemic. When we look to other areas of the province, we need to remember that this is a province of extremes, not just in economic terms, but also climatological. We've seen some very severe climate events here, and of course, some natural disasters that have had significant economic and social impacts. We should not forget the fires that took place around Slave Lake and in Wood Buffalo or Fort McMurray. We should not forget the flooding that took place in Calgary and in the surrounding areas. And we should not forget, of course, some of the hail-related events that took place in recent years as well. These things all have implications for both fiscal policy as well as developmental policies. When we speak to the issues that sit in the future for this province in the 21st century, there are three things that come to mind. The first, from a horizon scanning standpoint, has been the historical lack of a rural development policy outside of industrial development. We've not had an active rural development portfolio since approximately 2010, 2011, and have only recently seen the re-emergence of such a position within Cabinet. When we look to economic development and fiscal policy more generally, there are significant challenges facing municipalities as they try to generate revenues when given only reduced opportunities to do so under the Municipal Governance Act, and when they continue to try to adopt innovative and new ways to generate revenues are often met with significant skepticism and capacity issues. At the same time, the current government is withdrawing supports in the form of grants and funding for municipalities across the board, and this again further complicates patterns of boom and bust and growth and expansion. And perhaps lastly, we need to speak to issues of the rural and urban divide, not from a social standpoint, but from a demographic and from an economic standpoint. Cities in Alberta continue to grow, and most of the economic and population growth in this province has been taking place between the cities of Calgary, Edmonton, and Red Deer. At the same time, rural communities, particularly those that are more remote and more rural, continue to see their populations decline, and as a result, their populations age. This has serious implications in terms of service provision, in terms of policy making, in terms of priorities, and in terms of the capacity of these communities to respond to these challenges.
L'État du Canada rural est un rapport publié tous les 2 ans par la Fondation canadienne pour la revitalisation rurale. Cette année, le rapport examine les principaux problèmes des communautés rurales dans chaque province et territoire. Voici Lars Ahlström, un des auteurs pour le chapitre de l'Alberta. En regardant la province, dans l'ensemble, on pense aux problèmes de développement ruraux qui sont présentés en termes de leur définition par leur complexité, l'intégration et le dynamisme. C'est une province de changement où il y a eu des changements politiques et bien sûr économiques. Pas seulement à travers son histoire, mais surtout dans les 15 à 18 dernières années. Nous avons eu 5 premiers ministres différents en un peu plus d'une décennie avec des idées radicalement différentes sur le rôle de la politique et les priorités des communautés rurales dans la province. Ça signifie que les municipalités, avec les lois récentes, ont eu du mal à trouver leur place dans une province où les changements économiques sont si...
All right, welcome back everyone to our second afternoon. It seems like these 2 days have just flown by, but I hope you're enjoying them as much as I have been. Really excited to get into the home stretch here, into our last afternoon of programming. I hope you all had a good lunch break or maybe late morning break, depending on where you are. Hope you got a chance to get out, go for a little walk, maybe snap a photo of where you are coming from and share it with the hashtag #ShareYourRural or Mon Milieu Rural. I did see Dr. Kathleen Cavani had shared some awesome photos of where she is at. On the East Coast. I hope some of you might have found some time to snap one of those pictures and share that with us as well. I also did a little bit of homework and I was looking at the State of Rural Canada report and seeing where that's been picked up and downloaded. And I don't mean to turn it into a competition, but I will say that the Ontario chapter has been the most downloaded, but that the PEI chapter is only one download behind. So size of province does not correlate to number of downloads. So I encourage you to get out there, check that report out, share it in your networks, and see if we can get that information spread out and shared with as many people as possible. So to move into our afternoon presentation or segment, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Kristen Catherwood. Kristen is a board member, and I had the pleasure of serving parallel terms with Kristen on the board. So I'm really happy to turn the mic over to her now, and she is going to introduce our first speaker for the afternoon segment.
Thanks so much, Kyle. Thanks for that lovely introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are, this great big country of ours. As Kyle mentioned, I'm a board member of SURF, and I'm also the director of Living Heritage for Heritage Saskatchewan. And I'm joining the conference today from Treaty 4 territory in rural southern Saskatchewan, the traditional lands of the Nehiyawak, Nakota, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, and Michif peoples. Today, it's my privilege and pleasure to introduce fellow folklorist Shayna Jones. Shayna is an award-winning actor, a playwright, a folklorist, and a multidisciplinary spoken word artist specializing in performance poetry and traditional oral storytelling. Shayna has performed for theatre companies, schools, and festivals across Canada and internationally, including the Nelson Storytelling Festival, Tales Alberta Storytelling Festival, Toronto Storytelling Festival, Montreal Intercultural Storytelling Festival, St. John's Newfoundland Storytelling Festival, as well as the Iranian and Scottish International Storytelling Festivals. As a folklorist, Shayna combines her passion for live theatrical performance with the study of traditional African and Afro-diasporic folklore and contemporary Black experience. Presently, she is the founder and leader of a federally funded project called Black and Rural, a multi-year artistic investigation into the hearts and minds of Black folks tucked away on the Canadian countryside. Partnering with both arts and heritage organizations, her vision is to gather, honor, and showcase Black and rural Canadian life through a nationally touring performance and education series. Learn more about her and her work at www.wearestoryfolk.com. Shayna is currently based in Caslow, a town of about 1,000 people in the beautiful Kootenays of southern British Columbia. Please welcome Shayna Jones.
I am Shayna Jones. I am working on a creative project based on the lives and stories of Black folk who live in rural settings, like myself. I seek to thoughtfully and soulfully reach out to and engage with those who are willing to share their stories with me. My aim, then, is to weave these stories together with Afrocentric movement, rhythm, and melody to create a performance piece that gives voice to the experience and wisdom of Black folk tucked away on the countryside.
And Noemi, though she was actually quite a lovely girl, not only...
Why do they, we, live removed from the clamor of the city? Why do they, we, put up with being such an obvious minority? With skin so deeply colored, what does it mean to belong? To this land, to our roots, to one another. What is it to belong anyway?
Generation upon generations ago, African men and women, my ancestors, were stolen from their homes, Generations upon generations ago, African men and women, the brave ones and the bold ones, the smart ones and the simple ones, were stolen out of their beds in the night, plucked off of their fields in the day, and they were chained together. Generations upon generations ago, African men and women, my ancestors, were forced to march across their own land. They were stuffed into great big ships like sardines, packed one on top of the other. They were cramped upon these ships for weeks and weeks as they were boated across turbulent waters and then dumped upon a new land. One of these lands was this one, Turtle Island. Ability to carry heavy loads, and then if they were deemed fit, they were carted away to their new existence as slaves. My ancestors. Life for these African men and women now called slaves was certainly not easy. From the crack of dawn to the pitch black of night, my ancestors were forced to work. There was an overseer whose job was to oversee these African men and women, to ensure that they did not stop to wipe their brow, that they would not pause to catch their breath. But if he discovered that one of them did, he would signal to the driver, who would come with whip in hand to lash that African upon his back, to whip the African woman upon her legs to ensure that they kept working out on the fields, the beautiful countryside. These African men and women, my ancestors, caught in such a devastating situation, would sing as they worked, allowing their voices to rise up and mingle with the clouds, allowing their voices to reach the great blue of the sky, a beacon of hope and possibility as they labored in the fields. They would sing something like, well, well, my back is bleeding, hell, hell, my soul is pleading, hell, hell, heaven, won't you let me in, hell, hell, heaven, let me in. My ancestors. Now, some of these African men and women, as they labored through their days, the overseer and the driver at their back, were graced enough to have a master with some kindness in him. And one of these days, one of these masters received a fine gift. He got a great big juicy ham. And this master loved him some ham. And when he received this big, fat, juicy ham, well, he wanted to invite others to feast upon it with him. He invited his aunties and uncles, sisters and brothers, nieces and nephews, his neighbor from across the street, and Joe Schmo from along the way to come in to his home and feast with him. So open-hearted was he. Now, did he invite the slaves? Well, no. There were some lines that he just wasn't quite ready to cross. But pay that no mind, pay that no mind. The master, with his friends and family, was seated at the table. He had his fork and knife in hand and began to carve down that ham, began to serve out that ham, and together they ate down every last morsel of that big, fat, juicy ham until there was nothing left of the ham but the ham bone. At this point, the master thought of his slaves. So he called to the little black boy who was always waiting patiently in the corner. And the master said to him, "Boy, get on over here." "Yes, master," the boy said. "You take this ham bone," said the master, "and you give it, well, give it to your mama. See if she can think of something to do with it." "Well, yes, master. Sure, master. Thank you, master," the boy said. He took that ham bone and skipped it on down the dirt path to the shack where his mama was waiting. Now, I like to think that his mama was one of those big, full-bodied African mamas. And I like to think that this big mama looked at that ham bone and said, "What am I gonna do with this?" Well, she thought about it and thought about it and thought about it, and then, she knew. You see, Big Mama, like any good big mama, always had a pot of beans cooking over the fire. So she took that ham bone and she placed it into her pot of beans. She let it sit and simmer, simmer and sit to give her beans flavor. When she was satisfied with the flavor, she took that ham bone out and gave it to the big mama of the next shack, who put it into her own pot of beans. And then that big mama took the ham bone out, gave it to the big mama of the next shack. And round this ham bone went, giving each of those pot of beans flavor. You see, stories, any story that is from the heart and soul of a person or a people is like that ham bone. It can skip around from person to person, home to home, community to community, nation to nation, giving us all the flavor of insight, deeper understanding, and greater compassion for a person or a people we may not have had room for in our heart until we had heard their story. I bring you ham bones today. First, let me take you to July 19th, 2020. A lone Black woman hides herself away 3 weeks after the infamous murder of George Floyd in Minnesota, Minneapolis. This woman is tucked away as her quaint and quiet rural town in Canada joins together in solidarity. Her little town is holding a Black Lives Matter rally. She is one of the only Black folk around. In the weeks leading up to this rally, this lone Black woman could not walk down the main street of her town without hearing, "Ah, honey, I want you to know that I stand behind you. I've got piles of friends who were Black back where I grew up," one soul said. She could not walk down the street without hearing, "Oh, have I ever told you how beautiful I think your skin is? I'm so happy that you can walk safely down these streets." Or, "My goodness, I don't imagine that you experience any kind of racism in these parts, right? Folks around here don't really care that you're Black." To all of these things, week upon week, she would smile, nod, and wish that she could just disappear. A Black man out on the northern tip of a small town in Western Canada loves to spend his days out in the wilderness. For when he is surrounded by the canopy of trees, the wild animals, and especially the wild edibles, he feels at home. He feels his soul come alive. He feels closest to his ancestors. On this day, while in the wilderness, he is hunting for mushrooms, boletes and shaggy manes, chanterelles and chicken of the woods. He's been at it for hours and hours and has bagfuls of mushrooms clipped to his belt loops to prove it. It has been a glorious day. His hair is covered in leaves and lichen. He smells like yellow cedar. Moss is stuck to his clothing. He is in a paradise. As he is about to make his way home, only a few miles off, he stumbles upon a couple, slightly older, in their 60s, a white couple. And when they see him emerging from the wilderness, they are taken aback, unaccustomed to such a sight in the woods. The woman of the partner clutches the hand of her mate a little harder. The Black man, gathering mushrooms, communing with his ancestors, is used to such a reception. And he knows to help them feel at ease, he will smile, he will make sure he is polite, he will make sure that they know that he is just out hunting for mushrooms, not them. As they walk off, he reflects upon the fact that he'd much rather be in the density of the forest, where there is no one to have fearful assumptions about who or what he is. A young girl A young girl lives in a rural northern town, in a province I won't name to respect her privacy, but this young Black girl is in love with the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC and the Spice Girls. It's the 90s at the time. And she wants nothing more than to sing and dance and fit in with her friends, as most young people do. And given her small town rural setting, most of those who are around her are indeed white, or at least lighter skinned. And she thinks they are all beautiful, more beautiful than her Black-skinned self. And she works hard to ensure that her Blackness is not a subject of conversation. Yes, she always has to be the Black Spice Girl. Yes, she always has to take on the role of the dark and wicked one in their games of play. But if she can let that slide, if she can forget that she is so darkly colored, maybe they will forget too. Maybe she can be just another country girl with them. But try as she might to distance herself from the color of her skin, she is reminded of it almost every day she walks through the streets of her little town. There is no one else who looks like her, save her mom and dad, brother and sister. She just wants to belong. These ham bones, these little windows I give you into the experience of a few Black and rural Canadians are meant only to provide a window, room for a little bit of compassion, curiosity, for those Black folk who find themselves alone in quiet towns. For you see, the very first ham bone, that lone Black woman hiding herself away while her beautiful townsfolk hold a Black Lives Matter rally, that lone Black woman was me. And I remember that day so clearly. The striking juxtaposition of being so supported and yet feeling utterly alone. I remember on that day wishing, blessing my townsfolk, and yet tucking myself away, clinging to a book of Black poetry by Langston Hughes, searching within his poetic phraseology for a sense of community to bear this load with me. For though I was grateful for the encouragement, grateful for the love and the show of support from my town, to be the only one to hold it all, to be the only one to stand in the face of it, proved overwhelming for me. And that is where the genesis of the Black and Rural Project was born. For as I read Black poetry on the day my town marched, I wondered, what is it like for other Black folks who find themselves alone in rural settings? What is it like for Black folks who do not have the ready show of multicolored faces to stand with them in moments such as these? Why? Why am I? Why do others live in these quaint and quiet towns, forfeiting a show of multicultural support? Why? Over the course of collecting stories, and I am in the middle of such a beautiful endeavor even now, over the course of collecting these stories, I have heard from Black and rural Canadians across the country. One woman said to me, "Oh, Shana, Though I came to this land from Mozambique only a few short years ago, never before have I valued the history and the beauty of the land I came from. Shayna, to stay connected, this woman said, I read about Black religion, Black ritual, African religion, African ritual, African symbolism, traditional dress and fabric, jewelry and headdress. I read to know my culture even more deeply than I ever did when I was there. Another soul says that she walks through her rural town bedecked in her African finery, determined to not for a second cast her eyes down because she is alone in her town. She is there to work, and she will work proudly as the African that she is. In her words, she was not going to be concerned about the old school farmers who gave her a once over. Another soul said to me that he spent years and years climbing the corporate ladder down in the United States, made it to the top of his game, had buckets of money, in his words, had proven that he as a Black man could rise out of the poverty of his youth and to beat the white man at the white man's game, his words. And though he had made it to the top, he found he was not free enough to make his incredible story too short. He bought himself a plot of land in rural Canada. And for the past 25 years, he has been homesteading, alone in his Blackness, but utterly free. He told me with great pride that he was the one who dug his own well, laid the foundations for his own home, built his own house, and though he is alone in the color of his skin, he feels more grounded and more connected to his roots than ever. There are so many voices I could share with you, but I'll give you one last. A young man, Black man in rural Ontario, one of the first that I spoke to, shared that after the events of George Floyd's murder, he, who had been one of the few Black faces in his town for his whole growing up, and even now as a young man, he found that now that the attention was given to him, he wanted to rise in it. He was the one to organize the Black Lives Matter rally. He was the one to create space for the few colored faces in his town to show what was within them, rallying behind this social movement. And he said to me that creating that space for him in his small town, a town he loved, creating that space was one of the proudest moments of his life. His story, all of these stories, and I tell you, the myriad of stories that I am getting to encounter listening to Black and rural voices, all of them are ham bones that provide flavor. The flavor of insight, understanding, and greater compassion for a person or a people we would not have been open in our hearts to had we not first heard their story. Black life does not have to and is not necessarily synonymous with urban life, as we are tempted to believe in our North American culture. There is nuance. It is as nuanced as each individual soul. I want to leave you with a compilation of the actual voices of participants of the Black and Rural Project. The theme of this compilation, it is a short video, the theme of this was a reflection on what it is to be tucked away and hidden, the freedom that we are afforded while being without witnesses, and also the danger, the precarious situations we place ourselves in by being so alone in our tucked away setting. Around this theme are the voices that share other threads of this tapestry of the Black and rural experience. But this is by no means definitive. There are many more voices to hear from, so many facets of rural Black life to still bring to the fore, but I bring you this as a taster, a little bit of flavor from these ham bones. This is the No Witness video. Thank you for listening.
There is a significant portion of me that needs to be hidden and that needs to be tucked away.
I come from this country, and this country may never really have a place for me as I would want it to be, like that it would accept me as I am, like in my complexity and who I am.
My skin is a literal like weaving that that tells quite a heavy story.
Originally, my desire to get out of town, get away from the city, was my desire to be away from police officers.
We expect Black people to be in certain spaces and absent from others. If we're in the city, it's like, oh yeah, Black people in the city. But in the outdoors, it's like, what are you doing here? You're such a surprise.
Growing up, I actually felt like being a Black person born in Canada. I thought that was new.
Being a novelty and nobody paid too much attention to you. You know, there'd be the odd person that would kind of look at you.
I'm gonna have to sort of make my own identity here somehow, because there is no tribe for me.
You will never be close to whiteness. It's a futile aspiration that'll result in heartape.
I feel a lot more comfortable and I feel a lot safer in the forest than I do.
Even when I have
like I felt like
My desire to get out
my heritage, my friends, there's still an alienation of my skin.
If you're not in the urban areas, if you're in the rural areas or in the wilderness, you're out of that check box. Where are witnesses?
Black skin in the forest. Do you mean well or are you dangerous? Black skin in the forest.
Thank you, Shayna, for that powerful and stirring and truthful performance. I wish we had a lot more time to have a discussion about this. We just have a few short moments. I have a couple questions I'd like to discuss with you. The first is, what role does art, particularly performance art, play in sustaining vibrant rural communities? And can you discuss why you think spoken word is a particularly effective way to share the stories gathered in the Black and Rural Project?
Yes, thank you. Well, I'll start off by saying I'm no expert. I only speak from the place of being a gratefully rurally dwelling individual and a performing artist as my work. And through my experience and through having conversation, the role of the arts, and especially the performing arts, is creating a space for storytelling, a place for encountering the other in a way that can speak to bypass just our intellect, but speak to our heart and our mind and our soul. And I believe, from my end of things, that to actually galvanize myself into action, to care about how my town is doing, I have to be drawn from within, drawn from a sense that I matter, drawn from the place that my voice and my perspective matters in this town. When I feel that I matter, I want to contribute. And seeing yourself represented in the arts, seeing a fraction of your story told artistically, it really does a lot to strengthen a sense of belonging, therefore a sense of caring, and therefore a desire to get involved. The arts, as I see it, can undergird the incredible academic work that can be done to present the stats and present the facts of what's going on. And then the arts can infuse that with the kind of tug at the heart that I believe creates the deepest amount of change and investment. And then you asked why spoken word. It's what I love. And I'm a great believer in that whole saying of you need to find where your greatest joy meets the world's greatest need. And so I firmly believe in the filmmaking as a way of telling story, and dance and all of those other beautiful art forms. But for me, given this work, the spoken word is where I find life and where I can communicate the clearest. And so that's why I believe, for me, it is the most important, but I believe really the heart is just to tell story and honor people's story by listening. And that's how we will get involvement. If that makes any sense.
Yes, it does. Yes, and I think all of us watching can agree that storytelling, as you say, is your way of communicating. It's your great gift because it's powerful. And I think it's something that's lacking sometimes in our current world. There's stories everywhere, but the actual act of just sitting and listening, as you say, to the spoken word, to the voice of someone else, is a really powerful act in our increasingly busy world. So thank you for bringing that gift to us again. So to move on to perhaps some of the content which was explored in the past half an hour or so that we've listened to you, could you share with us some common misconceptions that people may have about living life as a Black and rural person? And following that, in your experience, do you find any common ground in the experiences of being a racialized person and being a rural person?
Yeah, what a good question. And I will be tempted to take way too much time to answer, but I want to be respectful.
Take the time you need. Take the time you need.
Thank you, out of respect for the next voice to speak. But, I set out with the Black and Rural Project wanting to defy misconceptions. The misconception may be that a Black person in a rural setting is miserable or unhappy, or a Black person in a rural setting is a target of extreme racism. And the best way I will answer right now is that the stories that are coming to the foreground, some of them are meeting stereotypical expectations and some of them are defying. And so what I'm learning through listening is that the thing that is going to be most radical is to try to ask questions that get to the heart of each of these expressions, those who are experiencing what you would assume a Black person would experience in terms of isolation or hardship, and those who are thriving in terms of loving being away from settings where they also don't feel they belong, but they are a majority. The question of why and how these individuals, these Black folks, how they bring themselves to face their day, how they are grounding themselves in their Black heritage or lack of a connection to their Black heritage. That has been more compelling to me rather than are they fitting a stereotype or not? Not a stereotype, but a conception or not, misconception or otherwise. And in terms of the racialized and rural connection, oh yeah, for myself specifically, I only started thinking of myself as racialized in these past few years. I've always experienced my Blackness, but being a racialized individual is a new way of navigating myself. But being racialized in the sense of being an obvious entity that can be examined and poked at and reacted to. In the midst of loving my little town, I am so visible. And if I'm having a good day or a terrible day, I'm one of the faces you look at. And that has its beauty and it's tiresome. So I do, and I could go on for another 45 minutes, but I'll just leave it at that this racialized notion and then being such a clear minority, obvious minority, has so much room for, there's so much room to be an agent of positivity and change. And it can be very tiresome, the feeling of bearing a heavy burden alone. And yet there is beauty and lots that can be accomplished if one can hold it. But I have to leave it at that out of respect. But I'm very open to dialogue and conversation, more with you, Kristen, or if anybody is listening and is curious to learn more about the project or what I have to say, please reach out.
Thank you, Shane. I'm going to take the liberty of asking one last very quick question that I want you to just answer. I want you to just answer on the back foot, just what comes straight to mind. In your perfect world, what would rural Canada look like in 25 years?
In my perfect world, what would rural Canada look like in 25 years? Rural Canada would be a place for the urbanite to encounter quiet, the beauty of the land, and to be able to do so without feeling like they don't belong. In 25 years, rural Canada, assuming that it's a location as beautiful as the rural place I live in, rural Canada would be a place for healing where people can encounter the land and not be burdened by the misconception that you can only be rural if you are a certain kind of person or look a certain way. Cast that aside and allow the land and the quiet possibility to be the healing balm that it is. That's my goal for 25 years from now. Thank you.
Thank you, Shayna. Thank you for your time today. And everyone, please check out wearestoryfolk.com to learn more.
And blackandrural.com.
Right, and blackandrural.com. Thank you, Shayna. Thank you so much. And now I will pass it back to Kyle.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful and powerful segment. I was following along in the chat and I see that some people have already signed up for your newsletter, Shayna. So I would encourage others to get in and check that out and share Shayna's work. I had the privilege of interacting with Shayna a few times in the lead up, and I'm just so thrilled that you are able to join us today and share with us. So thank you so much on behalf of the organizing committee and SURF as well. So next, we're going to move into our next segment, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker today. That speaker is Alexander Rieford. So Mr. Rieford is the director of Les Jardins de Métis, or Rieford Gardens, and of the International Garden Festival, and was instrumental in creating the not-for-profit organization that purchased the gardens from the Quebec government in 1995. He's the co-founder of the International Garden Festival, one of the premier garden design events in the world. The gardens are a leader in nature conservation, undertaking the creation of an ecological park on the banks of the Métis River. Alexander Rieford is a member of the board of directors of various local, provincial, and national organizations committed to gardens, historic preservation, and culture. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Mr. Rieford, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Kyle, and welcome to everyone. Thank you, Shana, for such a wonderfully powerful presentation. You're a very hard act to follow. So in the next 15 or 20 minutes, I'm going to present to you with a story, my story, a very different story, frankly, that comes from a very different place, a place of privilege, but a place where I think you'll find some overlap, because we, like you, believe forcefully in the power of art and artists to curate orality. So my talk is mostly geared to how, over the last 25 years, I've been working at the gardens since 1995. So I just finished my 27th year in the tourism and cultural industries to share a few stories and maybe success and failures of this experience. But I do want to thank you for being here today. And I was able to join some of the conferences this morning to realize how wonderfully powerful the messages are. I work in a beautiful place, so I'm going to use some images to illustrate my talk, because I think that's the best way for me to speak to my particular story. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to pull up a few images and speak over top of those in the next number of minutes. Hoping you can all see this. So I run a garden in eastern Quebec. It is a large garden. It is a garden that covers 100 hectares, about 200 acres of shoreline property, beautiful part of the world. We are in the Lower St. Lawrence Gaspé region. So for those of you who don't know the region, we have approximately 200,000 population in the Lower St. Lawrence, 100,000 in the Gaspé region. So that means 300,000 total population of permanent residents. We are 600 kilometers from Montreal, 350 from Quebec City. So we're in a genuinely rural area of Quebec. Our local regional government has a total population of 17,000, and the village in which the gardens sit has a population of 265, maybe a little more this week, because we've got some positive immigration coming in the post-COVID world. But it's still a very small and highly rural community. And I have been working in this region now since 1995, and took to the creative economy as a response to the various challenges we were facing in running a tourism operation in a highly seasonal business. As you can imagine, even with climate change, gardening in this country tends to be a fairly short season. We've got about 110 days without frost in our region, so a very short growing season, and equally short tourism season. So like a lot of other regional tourism operators, as in Quebec in particular, with the return to community college at the end of August, well, we lose our employment pool, and our visitorship plummets significantly from the end of August, early September onwards. And in COVID, of course, we've had no international tourists. So we've been faced with a kind of a double whammy, perfect storm of dealing with the many challenges of fewer workers and fewer visitors. But I'd like to say that we're in the perfect environment, because we're allowing ourselves to welcome visitors of all ages. In the year 2000, as a response to the Millennium Project, we initiated a garden festival. And it really was a response to our need, which is the same need, frankly, of cultural institutions across the country, to broaden their visitorship and to reach down to a different clientele. Museums and contemporary art galleries in this country tend to be frequented, or have been until recently, by a fairly well-educated, mostly white population, mostly urban or urban on vacation. And we saw the coming storm of having fewer and fewer white-haired visitors to our gardens, and thought we've got to become more hip, more adventurous, more connected, more aware of the environment in which we live. So we've done that in a couple of ways. This is a view looking down towards where the gardens are situated. We're in the bay at the bottom of this road. It's a very rural economy, mostly dairy farms, very prosperous, very small villages, 99.1% francophone. So we have the smallest English-speaking population of any region of Quebec. I happen to be an English speaker, and a handful of my staff speak English, but it is a mostly unilingual francophone community with a handful of bilingual people. It's a remarkable landscape. So as Shana was saying, the rural regions of this country have much to go for them, and one of them is the beautiful environments in which we live. We happen to have one of the more spectacular ones with the St. Lawrence, which is our neighbor, our ally, 55 kilometers across at this point, a large body of water, nothing but beauty, nothing but perfection, and in the summer at least, a wonderful partner in the garden experience. So as I mentioned, we come from a place of privilege, so a very different environment from many others. Perhaps this is an old country estate that my family developed in the late 19th century. So it is a place where rich people came to summer. I don't summer here and I'm not rich, but I sort of part of that tradition of wealthy people who've taken on the country and the countryside as a kind of their playground. And in this case, my great-grandmother, a Montrealer who came here from the early years of the last century until she stopped coming in the 1950s, developed on her large estate this enormous garden. So she was a woman of privilege who grew up in a large home in Montreal and flourished in the Anglophone community of that city, but was a woman who was very open to every art and every performance imaginable. So that really gave us some of the cues. So the storytelling in our instance is to build upon the past and make it relevant for the future. And we've done that really by curating creativity. And what do I mean by that? Well, we've broadened and reached out to artists across this country, across the province of Quebec, across the country, and indeed internationally, to create some of the most dynamic and interesting and creative installations in the outdoor environment that can be seen anywhere in the world. Now on the left is a beautiful photograph of my great-grandmother. On the right, an installation that was created by a Berlin-based designer, Thilo Folkerts, and his Canadian colleague. And it was a garden called the Jardin de la Connaissance. So it's a garden that speaks to the culture of books, the facts that books come from the trees that are turned into pulp and chips and become objects of admiration, and then in the kind of ecological cycle, well, can indeed go back to the earth. This is not a book burning thing, but all the same, it created all kinds of controversy for us. But that too is one of the great elements of curating creativity, is you can create all kinds of media interest just by inviting creative people to come and be with you. So we've got one foot in the past and we've got one foot in the future. The past is very rich in our case. We've got some amazing objects and a beautiful museum and historic house. And so our visitors come into our gardens and they experience a tourism venue with a mix of beautiful ecology and environments, some significant environmental programs, but also can explore the story of the property and its illustrious owners, but also on the same experience on the same day with the same ticket, see some of the most creative installations done by designers from around the world. So the past in our case is rich, and is rich also because it's the woman's story, which of course in today's environment is very helpful. It's a white woman of privilege all the same, but she was a woman of great activism. She was a great believer in the vote for women, and she was active politically, and she was active ecologically, and she was active philanthropically, and of course she was active in building a garden of significance. So the past for us is also an entrance, it's a portal into the future. So what we've learned, and I guess one of the messages I would share with you, is to create inclusive economies, one has to include every range of artistic discipline. And we've learned over time that that is possible. Now, gardens are a wonderful venue for that because frankly, gardens can accommodate, as we did this summer, dance and music and opera, performances, theater, visual artists, photography. So we're very fortunate in having that kind of inclusive environment. But there are very few exclusions in the rural Canada in the sense that our landscapes are spectacular. Even if they're privately owned, there's lots of extraordinary opportunities to invite or curate creativity if you so wish. The difficulty, of course, is finding an audience, and we've been able to build an audience, and I'll speak to that in a moment. So this is an old photograph that was used to inspire a brand new book. And so what we did in this case was we opened our archive of historic images And we invited a contemporary Canadian photographer from Montreal to essentially walk through the gardens using his current technology to recapture the same spaces, but using a contemporary approach. So it became a catalog and a book and an exhibition. And indeed, we're just taking the exhibition down as we close for the summer on this coming Sunday. But it does illustrate how the past can be a portal into the present, and indeed can create opportunities for the future. And creators, of course, love that kind of invitation. They love to be invited to pick through, to some extent, the bones of the past, to look at the best of the yesteryear, and to use that as an inspiration for their current contemporary work. There's a lot of artists indeed who are in a kind of a nostalgic zone, so they love to be able to work with older technology. This is a photographer who used Rolleiflex cameras from the 1950s and black and white technology, because of course the contemporary digital world is so full of color and so full of competitors, that to go back into a different world is to some extent a mark of uniqueness. We have a major collection of plants, and many of them are indigenous. Many others are exotic. These are one of the more famous exotic plants. They're from the Himalayas. And so that too has allowed us to tell other stories, which is all about the ecology of the plants, how plants react to the natural world. We're very well positioned, of course, because Canadians have come to embrace gardens and gardening in the last 2 summers. You know, we've been confronted with being confined to some extent to our homes and backyards. And well, of course, that's led to major investments in renovated homes, but it's also meant that the horticultural industry in this country has had the 2 best years in its history, because we want to grow, we want to be present, we want to eat well, we want to have our kids experience the joys, pleasures, and therapy that gardening brings to them. So in that case, I think COVID is an actual invitation to rekindle our connection to the natural world. And I think that's one of the elements that I think is an ongoing challenge to the rural communities of this country. Is in the previous generation, I grew up in a farm outside of Ottawa, in the Outaouais region of north of Ottawa. And so I know a little bit about how the agricultural economy in near big urban centers has shifted very, very quickly. In the past, all of us of my generation, I'm turning 60 next year, had connections to the farming world in some way. We had a grandfather on a farm, or an aunt who lived in the country. We had a connection to the natural world, which was more than that of a simple visitor who's going camping. We had a real visceral connection to the rural reality. That is pretty much gone for, I would guess, 80% of the Canadian population who don't live in the country. So it is sometimes difficult to rekindle those connections. We've done so in various ways. And the festival is really our portal into the creative community. So what is it? Well, it's an event where every year, indeed in a couple of weeks, we will open a competition. We invite designers from around the world to participate in our competition. Doesn't cost us, by the way, anything. We just use a digital portal to announce the competition. We get 150 proposals from various parts of the world, and we then build, with the help of funding from the Canada Council for the Arts and the Quebec Arts Council, these installations that are then exhibited on our property for the course of the summer. So as you can see in these images, they just give a brief insight to some extent into what we're positioning or what we're doing, but we are looking for a younger clientele. And I think if there's a future in the inclusive economies of the rural regions of Canada, it is that connectivity to the younger generation. We've seen a big shift, and I think everybody participating in this conference will understand the big shift, and how there's a giant and massive and wonderful exfiltration of urban dwellers into the rural economies of our regions. They're embracing the kind of opportunities that rural regions can provide them with. I think our challenge now is to keep those folks here, to keep them engaged, and to get the schools full of their children, and to try and give them a livable and workable lifestyle that will keep our rural regions alive and well. But I think we're on the right pathway. We chose to, as I mentioned, to sort of drill down, to drill broadly, to try and attract a whole different generation of visitors. So we've got a kids-free policy, which not many cultural institutions have, but is frankly a fairly inexpensive way for institutions to broaden their clientele to the broader community. And through our festival, which is this rather remarkable event, it is designed to allow people to have fun. So the one thing we sometimes forget in cultural institutions, particularly highbrow ones like gardens, is how boring they can be. You know, we're pitching ourselves to a very niche clientele of well-educated people who've traveled around the world, and we're trying to compete with Berlin and London and Paris. And we're able to do so, but we're also able to do so in a way that is fun and amusing and interactive. And it's a really wonderful niche to be in. And we're one of the few gardens in the continent who've done this. And these are not with large Jeff Koons-sized marzipan-like floral figures. We're using contemporary art installations that were designed by designers and built by our staff and exhibited outdoors. So this was won by some designers from Seoul, Korea, using very colorful nautical ropes. And you can see how the installations in and of themselves become a wonderful opportunity for parents to engage both with the outdoor world, but also with their own children. So creating creativity for us means what? It means inviting people to use our venue as an outdoor environment. It means inviting ourselves basically into the homes of others. And we've done that through a whole variety of collaborative partnerships. I think one of the key takeaways I've had of the last generation of working here is building relationships with educational institutions. So this is a case where this last summer we had 12 or 13 concerts that were curated not by me, not by some music-loving enthusiast, but indeed by the local Conservatory of Music, who helped us choose the musicians, found us the right people, helped us choose the program. And then with very modest budgets, we were able to curate a program of outdoor concerts in a stage that was built by another collaboration, which we developed with the McGill University Faculty of Architecture. So one of my invitations to you is to think of your local educational institutions not as competitors, not as feeders of your best staff, but also as partners. They have programs that can indeed help you build your own program. And we're a case in point. We've got a relationship with universities across the country. We've got McGill, we've got Concordia, we've got the University of Quebec in Montreal, we've got the University of Montreal, we've got Laval University in Quebec City. We've worked with the University of Toronto, we work with Harvard University in the US, and we've done so at basically no cost. They're all now looking for venues in rural communities to do interesting things. Why are they looking that way? Because they know that if you're an architect going through an architecture school over the next 5 years, you will spend your entire life as a student on a screen. And so they are looking for opportunities and venues in which to actually build things with their hands, to actually curate creativity, and to go from a conceptual mode to a constructive mode. And I think that's probably true of many other faculties, where institutions are looking for offsite experiences and looking for venues in which they can actually be active and have the students embark on a whole different kind of learning. So what we've learned, of course, over time is that the rural reality that we enjoy has connections around the world. This is a project we built this last summer, designed by a designer from Stockholm in Sweden. This was the proposal we got, and this is the built reality. So using local materials, in this case, this is flax stalks, which is a product that the local farming communities here are trying to rekindle or rejuvenate and return to the rural community, both for its fiber capacity, but also for the seed and the oil. And here we are turning this into an art installation on a grand scale, which intrigues, enthuses, and maybe perplexes some visitors, but all the same is a wonderful way to connect to materials and the materiality of the rural landscape. Because truth be told, if you live as I do in this community, you don't go onto a farm very often. Farms are highly productive industrial spaces with large machinery. They're somewhat dangerous. They may have pesticide and herbicide use. They certainly got hardworking farmers who don't have a lot of time to welcome visitors. And so there's a kind of an ongoing frustration of people who see these regions but don't actually have any experiences with them. Well, one of the ways to curate that connectivity is to actually get the rural community into the art institutions and use the materials that they're making, that they're using. So we missed the boat a little bit. We should have been the venue for the local farmers market. We're envious of those who did that project, but we're really celebratory of the rural community because it really is a community which is creating some enormously interesting products, and products, of course, that are not naturally used in art installations, but with a bit of help and a little bit of curatorial imagination, we can do something remarkable with them. Makes, of course, great images that can be broadcast around the world at the same time. Here's another project of very immense modesty. So in this case, we were trying to deal with the same issue that every garden across this continent does, and indeed public parks, who are trying to wean ourselves off of mechanized instruments that consume CO2 and either use diesel fuel or gas. We got way too much grass to cut. We don't want to be an overzealous consumer of various products, and we want to connect to the agricultural economy. So in our case, what we did was we imagined a project that combined two things. It combined a connectivity to the agricultural economy, but also a designed pasture for sheep. So I think we're the first institution to think of the sheep as a kind of a public visitor. So in this case, we invited a design school from Lausanne, Switzerland to imagine the perfect pastoral landscape for passing sheep. And so here we have a flock of sheep. In fact, we've got some on site today, who were gifted this wonderful summer haven for their passage on our property. Now, fair to say, and I declare this openly, these are sheep whose destiny is unfortunate. They end up being served as meals in our kitchens and on the tables of our restaurants. But sheep production in Canada is mostly indoors, and here these sheep have spent their summer outdoors. And they've done so in an environment which was custom designed by very talented designers for their happiness. So here we've got what we'd like to think are happy sheep. But it is this combination of rurality and design and ecology which has made this project so wonderfully successful. And you can see here the students building this project. So the other element, of course, is to get people involved in the fabrication, the construction, and of course, the promotion of these projects. So instead of just giving a contract to a local contractor, which of course we can all do, if we can find one at the present time, in this case, we used the students from the institution who came and visited, who did all the hard work and enjoyed doing so. So this is the real learning experience that these folks enjoy with this kind of hands-on learning. And who are the beneficiaries? Well, of course, it's the kids who probably have never seen sheep up close. And we like to think also the sheep who are given a fairly happy venue for their days on Earth. So it's a good case, I think, of where on a very modest level, with very modest budgets, this total project cost maybe 1,000 hours of staff time and $10,000, $12,000, $13,000 in material costs, which covered all of the costs from the fencing to the buildings. Was a very modest way to curate rurality in a very imaginative way. Another example for us, we're a garden with a big staff and a big institutional footprint, but we've got a lot of nearby villages who have none of this. They've got no art gallery, they've got no museum, they've got no capacity to create and curate. And here in this case, what we did was we took a designer, so in this case, a UK-based designer who'd done a project for us. We took the sheds that she had built for a project, so we had this material basically in our warehouse, and we curated a new project in a shoreline site in a nearby village. So this is a response to erosion. So it was a response to an ecological problem that had swept quite literally buildings off of their foundations. So the town was dealing with a massive tax loss and a kind of a depressed economy and a kind of a desperate plea for government assistance. But they were also gifted these amazing shoreline properties that had no obvious vocation. So we stepped in and said, okay, in the meantime, why don't we imagine these abandoned shoreline lots as a venue for a new creative environment? So in this case, we invited the designer, we hooked her up with the local town, we found the funds to build the installations, we built the installations, we installed the installations, and we created with a very modest budget a really remarkable new public space, which became for a number of years a really popular park. We're now in the process of imagining a new park in the same space. And you would be surprised. There are designers, whether they're landscape architects or visual artists in this country, looking for this kind of project. They're not looking for money. They're not looking for vast quantities of assistance. They're looking for venues for public projects to show their trademark, to trademark their creativity. So I'm not saying have them work for free, because in fact, we pay these designers real money, but at the same time, they're gifted a public venue, an opportunity to connect to the public, and a global market for their amazing, amazing images. In this case, this designer was blessed with the most extraordinary landscape, and you probably have very similar landscapes looking for a new vocation in your community. So we've had this very same discussion with other towns. We're about to help a town looking to build a lookout. So instead of building a rather ugly and awful lookout made of treated timber, which is the typical method in many of our towns, who got more enthusiasm than capacity to do good design. We're connecting them to a very talented architect who's going to turn that same lookout into a kind of a signature venue, both for his work, but also, we think, for a public looking for a different experience. So there are a lot of talent in this country. And indeed, one of the challenges is National Reconciliation Day tomorrow is to connect to the architectural community of Native Canadians across the country. There's a handful of architects and an even smaller handful of landscape architects. But wouldn't that be a great symbol of creating rurality if we reached out to some of those young designers who got all kinds of talent and are maybe frustrated in working for these large firms and looking for a place to articulate their vision in a rural community and connect to their own communities in ways that are imaginative. So that's something we're working on. But you can see here the power of creativity. You know, this is a beach timber collected by local volunteers, and basically turned the shed into one giant symbolic sea urchin. So awesome, beautiful, photogenic, popular, inexpensive. I mean, you name it, it had all the positive attributes of a creative installation. And there's the public space. So we also assisted in the creation of a new public park in a community which had way too much privatized space along the shoreline and not nearly enough public access. One other project, so we sometimes get ourselves into the political hotbed of trying to help redesign the region. So in this case, we were trying to help the government to think of building a better bridge. You know, governments spend vast sums of money on ugly schools and ugly institutional buildings and ugly bridges and ugly roads and ugly infrastructure. So why can't we, in our communities, try to help them build more beautifully, or at least better? And to do that takes a bit of political courage, because you're putting your aesthetic neck out in the line, but why not? You know, what's to be lost? In this case, the government of Quebec announced a new bridge over the river. It's going to be a $25 million project, vast sum of money. And we said, oh, we can do better. We can do better. We can do better with public participation. So we brought 30 students from the University of Montreal. This is the bridge that's going to be replaced. It's quite lovely, quite beautiful, 1929 structure, full of beautiful elements. It was a significant investment for the tourism economy when it was built. And the government, of course, is proposing a basically banal, ugly behemoth of béton, as you'd say in French. So not much of great interest. And so what we did with the students was we took this project, which is the one, of course, the government wants to build, and we turned it on its head. We had a long, week-long charrette, which is a kind of a design workshop. They came, they looked, they admired, they fought, they bickered, they created, they designed. They had a lot of fun because they are, in this case, urbanites coming to the rural communities. And they loved it, particularly in winter when nobody, frankly, comes to the tourism economies of Eastern Quebec. And with them, we created a really cool exhibition, which we presented to local mayors. And the winner of the project was also something that inspired us. So instead of having a bridge, or in using the old bridge, rather, it becomes Le Pont Berger. That's a kind of a play on words. But basically, it becomes a giant venue for aggrandized rural economy using sheep as the main connecting element. So frankly, not going to happen, unlikely to be built. But the exercise of bringing creative people to a rural environment, confronting them with the local citizenry, having them meet the mayors, in and of itself is a wonderful learning opportunity, because you connect the kids to the region. They begin to understand what the real realities are. Having mayors meet designers and architects in 2021 is a great exercise, because they see the value of design. They see the importance of good environmental design in the urban environment, as they're about to spend millions of dollars on new sewers and infrastructure. It's a great thing for them to see the alternatives, which can be as cost efficient, but also bring an aesthetic element. And lastly, another element of our creative curatorial approach was to build an eco house. So the eco house was built upon the foundations of an economy that is, in our region anyway, is built now increasingly on forestry and agriculture. So typically in our regions, and this is probably true of many regions in both Eastern and Western Canada, we cut the trees. The trees are cut locally. They're trucked to the local sawmill. They're turned into 2x4s. The 2x4s are put onto train beds and trucks, and the 2x4s are sent to Montreal, where they're sent to a large distribution network, and then those same 2x4s come back 6 months to a year later, and we use some of them to build our homes, and the balance are exported to other parts of the world. So we export massive amounts of primary materials at very low cost, and it comes back with a higher value added component, and we use them if we do in our own homes and buildings. So we try to kind of overturn that by creating a perfectly cyclical project in which the act of building becomes an act of investment in the community. So in this case, it's an interpretation center. It's now a co-working space, built with local woods, designed by local architects, constructed by local contractors, 85 different partners who gifted materials to it, and it's become a real center for excellence in green building that allows people, as they want to build, to understand the virtues of buying product either locally or within 100 kilometers or indeed Canadian, but to try and wean us off of the importation, for instance, the bamboo flooring from the Far East, when we have the best flooring material coming out of our forests that we're sending off to luxury homes in the United States and other parts of the world. So the idea of this project was to kind of shift the mindset and create something innovative and interesting. This is another building, which is a kind of similar approach, where we used local expertise and created the perfectly minimalist building in which we house our interns. So we're a big believer, by the way, in using domestic talent. So I'm somewhat aghast in our region at the importation of agricultural workers from various South American countries, and we're trying to battle that need by building venues such as this one, which is the interns' home that we built a number of years ago, where the interns who come and work for us can stay. So they're living in an architect designed home, they're working for us at a reasonable wage, and we hope they become, over time, not just creators to the Canadian creative economy, but why not they themselves create their own design workshops in the rural communities of this country. Canada's got some amazingly talented design people, and many of them can work just as easily in St. John, New Brunswick as they can in rural British Columbia and rural Alberta. It's amazing now the degree to which design can happen off-site. So I think we're trying to take our role and a leading role in that environment. So those are a couple of cues to illustrate how our gardens have become a venue for the creative economy. I can't give you any lessons. I can only tell you that we've been successful in doing this over a generation. We've had all kinds of awards gifted to us, but the greatest reward we've had is to see generations now. Indeed, we're now in the second generation of the children of designers we hired in the year 2000, 2001, coming to take part in our events, which illustrates the extent to which our rural regions can offer something that no other venues in this country can offer, which is an opportunity to work in nature with very talented people. And indeed, we can now get high-speed internet and good coffee, which were the two major impediments to the creative economy in the past. We now have that. You can have the best coffee in the local coffee shop, and you can get higher speed internet here than you can in many urban centers. So I think we've beaten those challenges. I think the next challenge we have is to figure out imaginative ways to allow the younger generation to make a good, solid living in the communities in which they've chosen to live. And I think we're on the right road. And one of the ways to get there is to hire creative people, or to at least give them venues to be creative. So that's my message today. I want to thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that awesome presentation. All the beautiful images. I'm not sure that the coffee would be enough to keep me from coming to visit, but I do want to say that I love the way this afternoon has kind of come together with these discussions of different types of creative storytelling, creative outputs, design, and how this really fits into this bigger picture and idea of inclusive economies. So thank you so much. One other thing that I do love is often at these conferences, we like to set up field trips, right? So when we're not joining virtually, we often go out and we visit some of these awesome community projects and initiatives. So if folks do plan on joining us in the spring in Rimouski, hopefully one of our visits can be out to your gardens, and we can get people out there to actually see this stuff for real. So if that isn't incentive to watch your email for that registration coming through soon, I don't know what is. So great. So we do have time for questions. So I'll ask folks to now put your questions in the chat and we'll kind of feed them through here and keep going. I do have some to get us started. So I'll get us started with this first one. So clearly, transforming your region has meant a lot of work and it's really great vision. So I'm wondering if, starting out, when you were starting out, did you have a sense of what collaborators and partners you needed to solidify to start? Or was that kind of an emerging thing that came out as you kind of got down to work?
Well, I should have said, and I want to admit that one of the great methods we've used, frankly, is stealing other people's good ideas. So, and the media world, the internet, the Instagram, there's so many great ideas in this world. Some of them will work for you, some of them won't. But in this case, our festival was quite clearly inspired by a similar event in France, where they have a very developed design culture. So we were not emulating anything other than saying, wow, that's a really cool idea, A. B, they've had an amazing press impact. So they've had articles in every design magazine around the world. So that really inspired us. And C, it was so youth driven. So we figured, gardens are boring. Gardens are dead. Gardens, if they don't renew their clientele, are going to be in a tough place. So we stole a good idea and it's worked out really well for us. So that's one lesson I guess I've learned over. We did also, the events in our sort of creative Drive for Culture was driven by a collaboration with the University of Montreal, who with one prof in particular said, I want my students to work outdoors in nature, in a garden. And we said, okay, we'll give you all those things. We found them a place to live. It only took, 2 weeks of our summer, but it was so wonderfully creative to have 30 able, energetic people on site with 3 or 4 professors. It practically killed us because our energy can be draining, but at the same time, it left us with this amazing idea that universities need venues in which to be creative. It's not economically viable to some extent. They're pretty impoverished. They don't spend a lot of money, but they can be great institutional partners. So, if there's an institution near you, make sure you're not missing them. But if there's not one near you, go and find them, because we found that, we can work with Harvard, which is, 1,400 kilometers away, and or Toronto, which is 1,200 kilometers away, or Montreal, which is 600 kilometers away. To some extent, distance becomes an advantage, and we forget how rurality has that opportunity. Sometimes the travel and the distance and the challenge of getting to a place is part of its charm. It's part of its deep importance. If you just think of one place in Canada which has had more press than any other in the tourism world, that's Fogo Island. That's a bloody hard place to get to. And it's very popular because it's a very hard place to get to. So sometimes distance can be a strategic advantage, because when you get there, you're there. And in today's world, when you're actually connected fully to a place, that's a serious advantage, because most of us are somewhere and elsewhere at the same time, because we're managing our family and our domestic lives and our messages and so on. But sometimes when you're actually in rurality, there's something wonderful about being that lack of connectivity, or connectivity to space and to nature. So that's another message, I guess, a takeaway, that what we thought was a strategic disadvantage turned out to be a really major advantage.
Right. And thank you so much for bringing that up. I think that's a really important message. And it's also something that we try to do a lot of at SURF, right? Is connecting people to academics in different places. And, if we don't have that in the network necessarily, we're always happy to reach out and connect people with other folks in different institutions. So folks who are here and joining us, if you do have questions about that, definitely check out our website, get in touch, because we like to think of ourselves as connectors, and, bringing different people together in different spots. And I think this is a great example of, how that can be a really important strategy. Awesome. So next question that I've got, what do you think has been your biggest impact in your region and community?
That's a good question. I mean, obviously the biggest impact that any institution like ours has is employment. So we've got 60 people working for us. We've gone from 20 to 60. So that's a big impact. we bought a lot of stuff. So we bought produce and materials. And so that's a big impact. But I would say the real impact that we've had is being, I would say, the engineer, and I use that term advisedly, sort of the engineer of a different approach to design, building, and cultural development. So we've taken our institutional model and we've helped others follow it, which is to say that we face the issue that a lot of rural communities have, which is, why are we bringing in this smart guy from Toronto or this bright woman from Vancouver or whatever, the kind of belief that we've got it all already here and we don't need creative people, and I don't like being told what to do. So we found ways to allow the creative people to create in ways which are open and not closed. So they're not coming as contractors for a town or a city. They're actually just doing something that they themselves enjoy. So they're not consultants. They're not vaunting their own skill sets necessarily. They're just being creative in a different environment. And we learned that with some difficulty over time, but we've learned that that's important to speak both languages well, i.e. the creators have to be creative in their own space and world, but we're not telling a town to build a new public park. We're just saying that if you want to build a public park, why not think of this as a way to do it? Why don't you think of this using local materials, imaginative techniques, local staff, local labor, but bring in a professional and the result might be better than if you just do it yourself. So it's sometimes a difficult argument because a lot of rural communities are pretty self-sustaining and they've done things well for generations. But we're also, and I think those who preceded me have spoken to it, it's a very competitive world. And so when you're going to a rural community, whether it's in Norway or Australia or Canada, you're expecting a pretty high level of everything, whether it's coffee or internet or design. So now we can offer good coffee and internet. I think sometimes we're pretty low on the design side. We're offering, modestly uninteresting public spaces. Our parking lots are shitty, the asphalt's lousy. So I think we got to up our game to some extent. And I think that's where we've got some really smart people in this country who can help us do that. And don't think that they're going to tell you to build the goods, just think of them as allies. And so we've learned that again, it's a tough lesson because it's a hard message to take to some towns and communities. And we've not always been successful, but when you build a really cool public space in a community that doesn't really have many resources, it's amazing to see how grateful people are for that intervention. So one of the takeaways is we can take our expertise out into the community and everyone's the beneficiary, whether it's the town, the citizen, or indeed the visitors who come to think of these communities as kind of cool places in which to come.
Cool. I like that a lot. Thank you. We had a bit of a follow-up question, and that I think flows into this really well. How has maybe folks' vision or impression of your project changed over time?
Yeah, another good question. Thank you. I've noticed a big change in the last 20 years. When we were on the scene in the year 2000 till 2005, our visitor numbers went up massively. We had some great success internationally, a lot of media attention, and now it's clearly a much more competitive environment. So frankly, Canadian cities are doing some amazing design work. You just think of how the awful Gardiner Expressway in Toronto has become a public park. To think of how that shift has occurred, how cities in this country have really massively invested in quality infrastructure. So we've seen a big change. We used to be the only kid in the block, and now everyone's doing it. Like installations, you can see them frankly around the world, and indeed Montreal has just invested massively in them this summer to try and reposition the city as a creative destination in the COVID world. So that's a big change. So we've seen a shift, I guess, in the competitive environment. But that's sort of natural. If I can steal somebody's idea, why can't somebody steal my idea to some extent? It's an open world, open framework, a lot of competition. But the one thing we forget, I think, as rural communities is we have something that no one else has, which is we've got within close proximity, pristine nature, amazing landscapes, and frankly, authentic people. So, you can go from my front door and be in a dairy farm in 3.5 to 4 minutes. That's pretty cool. I can be in a virgin forest in 15. I can be in a lake in 12. I can be in the St. Lawrence in 35 seconds. So we're not all in that environment, obviously, but it's amazing how the proximity of ecosystems is something that rural communities typically have that urban centers don't. I mean, you can't leave Toronto any longer unless you've got a 2-hour window to just fight your way up Avenue Road and across the 401 and all the rest of it. So I guess there's an ease of connectivity, I guess, is one of the things that we all enjoy. And I think that we undervalue to some extent as rural communities, like this ease of access. And why are people coming here now? Why are young people fleeing the cities and establishing themselves in rural communities? I think it's because they realize that spending 35 minutes to an hour in a car or a train twice a day, 5 days a week, is not an intelligent way in which to live. So I think we're going to be the beneficiaries of that proximity, and we've got to find imaginative ways to turn that into a major selling point. And that's certainly something that we've been working on here.
Cool. Another question just came through. What is your next big goal for Reeford Gardens? What is the next big step or big thing on the horizon?
Well, probably like a lot of us, we got a big sort of ugly infrastructure, put it that way. I've got a lot of buildings, workshops, sort of the back end of the gardens. We got a lot of stuff, garages, machinery areas, which is oddly enough at the center, the core of the physical site. So we figured out, how stupid is that? So we're giving our best venue to the worst possible usages. So we're rethinking our gardens to try and move all that stuff to the perimeter and to making that sort of workshop area, not just an aesthetic experience, but also kind of the core of our mandate. So sometimes you think of, barns and sheds and the agricultural economy, we think of that as being ugly infrastructure. Well, why it's so interesting is that's where stuff is happening. So if I'm a visitor to the rural community, I want to see the farmer milking his cows. I want to see the grain going into the hopper. I want to see the activity. So not dissimilar to that, we're thinking that this sort of back end, the behind the scenes stuff, is actually what people are going to want to see going forward. So we're in a sort of a massive investment in both planning and also execution, and in turning our workshops into both viable workshops, because we're trying to figure out how to deal with the issues that some of your previous panelists have talked about, i.e., how do you give people 12 months of work in a 6-month economy? So we're trying to figure out, different business models to workshop, whether it's, culinary products or Christmas wreaths or whatever, but we've got to find imaginative ways to give work to people who are otherwise sitting at home collecting employment insurance. And the other thing we're trying to do is to frankly protect the pristine environment around us. We're desperately hoping with the Nature Conservancy and other groups to kind of freeze development. So because I think we've seen a bit of the chaos, I would call it COVID chaos, with the kind of massive rural exodus. Well, it's driven a lot of, frankly, unfortunate building in the wrong places. So we're kind of dealing with, I guess, the kind of contemporary enthusiasm that's emerged from this exodus to the rural regions, and trying to keep some of the really beautiful, pristine green areas green, for fear that some promoter is going to turn it into a whole series of ugly homes or tiny houses. So we're oddly enough fighting those who were previously our best friends and allies. But I think it's a good fight, because I think having green forever is a major advantage to the curation of not just the creative economy, but also the rurality. I think if there's a challenge all our communities are facing, is to try and keep the authentic rurality authentic. I'm among those who kind of who tear up when I see all the the prairie grain elevators coming down, because I think for me that's an iconic element of the rural landscape. So I think it's important to keep that rural landscape up there in some way, whether it's a barn or a building or that. I don't think we want to turn our rural environments into industrial landscapes, because I think that would be absolutely the thing not to do. So we're doing our part in that fight to keep what is green today green forever.
Cool. That's another good concept to add to our theme list today, I guess. Authenticity. That's a really interesting thing to consider and keep on the radar. So I do want to pull on a couple of the other themes that we've been talking about a little bit here. So it sounds like you've described several kind of innovative things that you've been doing. I'm wondering if you could tell us how you define or maybe approach innovation in your space.
How I approach it, I pretty much embrace it. Like it's my best friend, I would say. Like innovation for us is really what drives us. I must say we have challenges like every institution. The people who work for you can embrace innovation at a different speed than I do. So, the challenge that we all have, I think, in the human resources side is to sell innovation within your own crew. because I do think that we don't have to sell it any longer with our visitor base. So we're in a tourism business, and our visitors come from all over, and they see innovation every day, everywhere. Whereas the people who work for us in our rural economies often see innovation nowhere, because they're not big travelers, and their capacity to travel is limited because they're not making a lot of money, whether it's working for us or somebody else. So I think that is one of the challenges. But yeah, for us, innovation really is a catchword. It really drives us forward. We're inspired by images. We're inspired by best practices. When we take on a project, we typically hire a student to try and pull out off the internet some of the inspirational images that you can find, and then go a little further and to try and find some best practices or maybe a model that's worked somewhere. And that really helps us to determine whether our project is really innovative or not, but also helps us frankly sell the project. If I can show that when I'm restoring a sand pit nearby, that it's been done in Germany and Belgium and the US, and indeed it's been done just up the road here, that helps me position that project both with my funding partners, but also with my own staff, because they realize that we're not really walking the plank into the abyss. We're actually building on a positive experience that somebody else has championed. So innovation in that sense, I think you've got to be a little humble, because frankly, every idea in this world has been had by somebody typically before. But our rural realities are so different that doesn't bother me. But yeah, innovation is really something that's very important for us. And we do that because we kind of siphon all the best off the internet and in books and publications, and myself and my staff are pretty aware the antennae are working. We're listening to the CBC and watching the news and trying to be present at great conferences like this one to try and realize what other people are doing elsewhere. Those are really great learning moments, but I think also great teaching moments when people can share their rurality with us. It really makes a big difference to make us realize that our challenges are the same. Our responses can be different, but the results can be equally impressive from whatever part of the world we happen to be working in.
Great. So we're getting close to our end time here. So I've got one final question that I think is a nice, succinct one that we can wrap up with. We've talked a little bit about these ideas of perceptions of communities and what people think about them, and how it's important to be able to, see yourself being able to pursue things in rural communities. So I guess the question is, what would you say to an artist or another creative worker who thinks that maybe they can't pursue a career in a rural community? And if you can't sell them on good coffee and good internet, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I think that it's a very good question, because I'm seeing this now. We've got a residency program. We've got artists living with us now, and you can kind of see they're in that space where they're thinking, can I make my creative life here? And I think the response is different for the different kinds of artists. I think visual artists in particular have a hard time being competitive in the rural regions, because the gallery space and the need to be there and the need for connectivity is so significant. I think the authorial, the playwright may have a different need, and they can often, as you can see the sort of mythology of John le Carré and all these other authors who write from the Cornwall, the Cornish coast just as well as they can from a London apartment, illustrates that you can be a very connected writer wherever you happen to be. I think it's a tough sell. I would admit it. It's a tough sell. Creative people can be as creative in rural environments, but I think for the genuinely creative people, they need other creators around them. So I think there's a kind of a balancing point. And I think, the Fogo Island type project, or the Banff Centers of this world, or even the gardens, you need a kind of a critical mass. You got to have enough creators to make the creative economy work. And I think that's where sometimes we fall short. We have a great artist in our community, and we've got a great writer, and we've got a great musician, but sometimes they're transitory because, one of each isn't enough. They need 3 or 5 or 7 or 15. I'm not quite sure what the number is, and we're competing with, the Richard Floridas of this world, who are saying that creativity happens in urban centers. That's where creativity occurs. So I think it's to each our own. Like I think I can be as creative here as I used to be when I worked at the University of Toronto. Maybe more so, maybe 10 times more so, but that's not going to be true of everyone. But I think it is true that in some instances, you can be as connected on Rail Route 132 or Rail Route 1 as you are on Bay and Bloor. I think you can be as connected. It depends a little bit on your personality, but I do think we got to face that truth. It's a tough truth. Are we welcoming enough Are we well enough positioned? Do we have enough public spaces? Do we have enough public that attend these events? So I think we got some work to do. We got to help our communities consume cultural products. And I think that really is one of the big shifts that has to occur. We've got to get our own citizens to be more generous consumers of the cultural products that are offering, because we can't live in the tourism economy alone. And the creators who are living in our communities, they need their public. So that is a different challenge. And I don't think rural communities alone can do that. I think that's a Canada Council thing. It's an Arts Council component. It's a cultural challenge across the country, but I think we're ready to face that. And I think the growing numbers of creative people living in our communities, I think, is an inspiration, and I think leads us in the direction where we can be hopeful that our regions aren't just going to be full of farmers and fishermen and lumberjacks, but we're going to have just as many authors and just as many musicians and just as many playwrights and maybe some creative dancers, and indeed, why not people from all cultural communities? Didn't speak to that component, but one of the things we've noticed in the world of architecture and landscape in particular, very open in women, men, every gender imagination, and I think there's some fields of that kind which are wonderfully positioned to be additions to our rural communities. So I would say embrace that, embrace the innovation, but embrace the creators, and I think we'll have a better community as a result.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's a great place, I think, to end on here. So thank you so much, Mr. Rieford, for sharing your expertise on this. It was wonderful to hear from you. And as I said before, hopefully, maybe we'll get to visit in person when we're in the region in the spring.
Great. Thank you so much.
Great. And so with that, it is time to shift into our next segment. So we've got another great, fantastic lineup of breakout sessions lined up for you. So I'll just remind everyone that you can access them by going back to the lobby and joining through the green buttons on the side of your screen. You can check those out. If at any point you have any trouble finding where you need to go, you can always click the question mark in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. This session will start now, and then it will go till exactly 3:55. So we'll be returning back here at 3:55 for our kind of closing remarks. And so we ask everyone to come back to join us there to get some reflections on the day, our closing remarks, and then our segue into the AGM that will be taking place after that. So please go enjoy the breakout sessions and engage with us. Tell us how it's going. Send those tweets, make those posts, and we look forward to seeing you back here at 3:55.